alliances or partnerships with other countries.
Yeah.
The second theme concerns Britain's capabilities, military, intelligence, security, and development assistance. And the third theme concerns Britain's domestic political will.
Yes.
I was hoping before we sort of enter the panel discussion, Robin, I think I spoke to Anna about this. If you could give like a brief sort of 10 minutes overview of this sort of the Global Britain, Global Broker paper.
Okay.
So everyone's
as a kind of scene setter thing. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. So everyone's familiar with it. And then under each of the themes are 2 to 3 questions. I will ask a question to one panelist and they can give the initial answer.
Yeah.
And then I was hoping it sort of would just break out into a conversation between the panelists on each of the questions.
Okay, moderated by you, obviously. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Brilliant. Well, that works very well for me. And I'll just close that off. That will work just fine. Obviously I've got some things I can say at the beginning to set the scene. So but specifically, just so I check on this, why I kind of, use this term or put out this particular angle as the way for the UK to think about its future role. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. And some of the things that I think we could do as a broker. Are you comfortable with me laying out some of the areas where I think we could add value?
I think that'd be great if you could lay out some of the areas.
Yeah.
And also, I know I told you the panel is scheduled to last for 130 minutes, which obviously is. But if you're willing to stay beyond that for Q&As for the extra 30 minutes, that'd be great. But if not, then obviously very understandable. So
I guess it's meant to run from when to when?
From 7 to 8:30.
Exactly.
But if you have the time to stay for questions and answers, then...
Oh, so the question and answers aren't inside the 7 to 8:30?
No, they're not.
Wow, you guys have long meetings. Do you think, Michelle? I don't know. Because I would have thought, yeah, I would have thought with an hour and a half, you could both have, we could have a conversation and you could get Q&A in. You're not going to start the Q&A with the audience till 90 minutes in?
Yes. Well, if we cover all the ground, then we can start it before.
Well, I would, I mean, I'd love to be there to be able to take or engage in some of the Q&A. But if I stay till 9, my dog might be really having to cross his legs, and because normally he gets his walk at about 7 o'clock, he can hang to 7:30. 8 is stretching it, but if I go to 9, that might be a whole different thing. And I might I've got to work out what my dinner situation is as well. So I will see on that. But if there's any chance, is everyone else staying on till 9 then? Michelle, are you staying on till 9? Richard? It'd be a bit sad if we all pulled off at.
But I'm also 1 hour ahead. So.
Oh, where are you?
In Germany, in Mainz.
Oh yeah, so it'll be 10 o'clock or something at your time when you finish. So Alex, I'm just Look, it's your meeting. You do whatever you want, but it would be really nice. I'm just saying. I think actually, even although there's a lot for us to cover, for us to just talk amongst ourselves and with you for an hour and a half is a long time. If I were you, far from me to tell you what to do, but I do moderate a few meetings as well. I would suggest that after an hour, if you want to go that long, it'd be great to get some comments in from people and we can answer first round of questions. And then if I need to stay on a little bit beyond 8:30, I will. But
I tell you what, I think we can probably cover a lot of the ground before 8:30, so we have time for questions and answers, and I can accelerate it.
Yeah, and then we can always cover more. If you know what I'm saying, we can come back.
No, exactly.
We haven't covered later on, but just so people have a sense of engagement. I don't know.
No, that sounds very sensible.
I think that would work.
That sounds great.
So it makes it a little less academic in that sense as well. Academics tend to go on for a long time. But
cheeky, very cheeky.
Except for Richard, who of course, it was a think tank as well as being academic. Even before he was running the Chatham House Europe program before I got there. So he is totally socialized in both directions. But Richard, do you have to live in 2 worlds of presentations of 45 minutes and presentations of 10 to 15?
Yes, I mean, of course, being an academic is very bad training for anything else, isn't it? Because nobody shuts you up when you're giving a lecture. Whereas, as you know, being a think tank, people are incredibly disciplined with their time.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's truly terrible training. Actually, I think it's why it's very difficult for people to move between the worlds. I mean, also the theory thing, as you know, on any academic paper, one third, the first third is literature review / theory,
Exactly.
which is absolutely useless for most people who want to know anything.
Yeah, I remember getting into a fight with, well, I will tell you, it was actually, because you'll remember this, Paul Cornish,
Oh, yeah.
after he gave one of our briefings to sort of one of our top level groups, in which I had just arrived, at Chatham. And he spent the first half an hour setting up, I mean, he spent literally 20 minutes trying to explain why this was an important question. And then he had about 5 or 7 minutes left of what was going to happen. And I was literally squirming in my seat, because you've got all these people around the table who only want to know what's going to happen. They obviously know it's an important question, because that's why they were there. And so I told him afterwards, but I just said, that was kind of interesting the way you did that meeting. I think next time it might be good if you actually started with this bit. But in any case, I found out later, he was absolutely, never been spoken to like that before. I mean, how dare I? I guess he was very good about it afterwards, but it was one of our first interactions. Yeah, it was not what I'd imagined. Right, I tell you, I'm just going to look at one quick thing as well while I'm waiting for us to start. Myself on mute while I look for.
Alex, what can you tell us anything about the audience?
Yes.
How many people you'd expect, nationalities, or are they all from the UK, etc.?
So we're expecting around 40 to 50 audience members. They are sort of made up of the Young Fabians mostly, and the nationalities is really actually an array between Britain and Europe. And we're also expecting people beyond the Young Fabians who are interested in the foreign policy. Obviously, I think most of our audience will probably be on sort of slightly to the center left or further left, because it's the Young Fabians hosting the panel, but hopefully we get some people on the right as well. So it's really quite a breadth of our audience members are, and they have many interests. It's not all just people who are interested in foreign policy. So hopefully the questions will be sufficiently broad as well.
Sorry, what's your status in the Labour Party? Are you affiliated like the Fabians?
Yes, so we are affiliated to the Labour Party, and actually we're just waiting for Catherine to join us. I'm not sure where she is.
Just some background
but
history.
Yeah, we are affiliated to the.
Just some background history. The
Society
was one of the founding organizations for the Labour Party. So more like we made a party because we were around and had nothing better to do, is kind of the internal mythology about it.
I knew the origin of the Fabians, but I wasn't sure whether you slotted into sort of independently, if you see what I mean, into the Labour Party, or whether you're very much under the wing of the Fabians.
So the Fabian Society is an independent organization, but we're one of a number of affiliate societies. I think it's like 14 or 15 now. It might be a bit more, actually. I think there's quite a few. So there's like labor-ish organizations that aren't officially affiliated, and that's like most of the ones you see. And then there's kind of like older traditional ones that have more direct links, but then we're not like underneath the party. We just have like this kind of traditional association. It's just weird laborness. It's not really relevant. It's just like anything else. It's just like lots of umbrella organizations underneath each other. So we're going to be going live to our Facebook Live in just a second. I just wanted to pop on to let you guys know. And once our next speaker comes in, Alex will kick you off. Thank you very much.
Mm. I'll give Catherine So before we start, I just want to welcome our Facebook viewers. We're just waiting for our final panelist, Catherine West MP, who's the Shadow Foreign Minister for America and Europe. When she joins, we can start. If she doesn't join within 10 minutes, then we can start and I can reserve some of the questions for her, hopefully if she can join us later. So perhaps I can give a short overview of the talk while we wait for Catherine. Thank you everyone for attending this event tonight on the future of British foreign policy. This event is based on a recent Chatham House paper authored by Dr. Robin Niblett, who is with us today in our panel, on Britain acting as a global broker, tries to chart a new course based on 6 key objectives, where Britain's capabilities, its alliances, and its political will coincide to ensure that it has the maximum effect on those key objectives. I thought perhaps I can hand over now to Robin, who can give us an overview of his paper. So everyone is familiar with the key concepts before we launch into this discussion, and hopefully Catherine will arrive and join us before the end of Dr. Niblett's overview.
Thanks very much, Alex. Pleasure to be here. Hopefully my site is working and my internet connection is nice and stable. If it isn't, give me a shout. But I'm pleased to have this opportunity to be able to join you and to lay out some of the ideas I put in this recent Chatham House paper, which you can find on our website if you wish, but maybe I'll put it into the chat line later on for those of you who can access it. And I suppose one thing to say right at the front end, this is a paper that is talking about what Britain could be, maybe even should be, but isn't necessarily about what the UK is or might even be under this government or a future government. Obviously, I'm trying to look to the future and put my 2 pennies worth to the table about the kind of country the UK should think of itself as being internationally and what kind of a role it can play in today's world. At the bottom of that thesis, I suppose, is to say the UK is not going to be able to be or reincarnate itself as a mini great power in the future, as perhaps some of the linkages to the concept of a global Britain did imply. And not even should it think of itself as a sort of independent, medium-sized power, finally free of the shackles of the European Union and able to go off and do whatever it wants to do with free abandon around the world. These concepts are kind of meaningless in what is a intensely interdependent world, and one which, ironically, the UK is amongst the most interdependent of any country in the world, as we've seen with the COVID crisis, but also as we saw after the global financial crisis of 2008-9, where again, the UK was hit even harder than most other countries because of its exposure to flows of trade, money, people, investment, etc. So that's the first point. Second, what's the context in which the UK is trying to redefine its role? Because I think Britain doesn't have the choice here to decide what its future role should be. It has to be in sync with the international context. The first thing to say about the international context is that it is an increasingly competitive world, one in which China's rise in particular is driving, I would say, an ideological contest, not simply a great power rivalry between the United States as, let's call it, the relatively declining power and China's the relatively rising power. There is an ideological dimension to this because the two systems of government that they bring are so diametrically opposed. A state-led system where citizens are subservient to the state and the state takes care of them and carries that sovereign power on behalf of its citizens, and a world in which, or a separate world of the liberal democratic camp as we might know it, in which governments are subservient to the society. A more chaotic world, as we've seen in the last 4 years in particular, but one in which nonetheless governments are at the beck and call of civil society, of media, where the competition for power between different branches of government is intense and alive. Those are two very different systems. And the liberal democratic one has tended to dominate, but is now being challenged much more explicitly because of the success, at least internally, of the Chinese model, which is being imitated, maybe not very successfully, by many other countries. The reason this context matters is that the UK really is part of that liberal democratic camp. It can't think of itself as not being part of it, as something else. And we can't simply sit in the world and say, you know, now that we've left the EU, we can play in all of the camps. We can have a golden era relationship with China and at the same time be close to the United States and strike a new relationship with the Biden administration. We can't say, oh, we're going to be best friends with Saudi Arabia, which does not subscribe to those liberal democratic values, and at the same time have a very close relationship with democracies in Europe. We are part of one side of that ideological contest, and it is going to influence the kind of country we will be on the international stage. And the last point about the international context I think is important is that having left the EU, the UK is going to have to fight really hard to be noticed the way it was noticed before. And there's no better example of this than the transatlantic relationship, where the UK had a value to Washington and to the United States because it had a seat at the EU table and was able to be influential in Washington because of the influence it carried as one of the biggest members of the EU. And what the EU does matters to the US, because whether it's digital taxation, whether it's trade policy, whether it's the relationship with China or with Russia, the EU has a very important voice, and Britain inside it was an important, therefore, player in Washington. Outside it, at a time where the US and the EU are trying to knit together a renewed transatlantic partnership, the danger is the UK is like the little child outside the sweet shop, looking at the window and wanting to be inside there, actually engaging with the goodies on the table. And the UK is going to have to fight its way much more proactively and thoughtfully to the transatlantic table than it did before. Third point, and I have 6 altogether, and hopefully I'll finish them in the next 4 minutes to be on time. Third point is that does the UK have the capacity, and this gets to the core of the point that Alex said at the beginning, does the UK have the capacity to play an influential role, having left the EU, in this more splintered context, which is not open, I think, very easily to mid-sized powers behaving as if they were great powers? Well, the simple answer I lay out in my paper is yes. Ironically, actually, the UK may be able to be a more influential player in a splintered world than it could in a world where there is a very strong transatlantic relationship, or where China and the US are able to get on and discover a good partnership. A world in which big blocs are living in harmony would leave the UK really on the edge of the table. But a world that is more competitive is one in which the UK actually does have assets to bring to the table. Those assets are, pretty obvious. It will remain, the UK, a big economic player, one of the biggest economic players well into the future. And I show some stats in the paper, even by 2030, even with COVID. And in fact, even if the United Kingdom were to lose Scotland, the UK will probably still be, in raw economic terms, sixth or seventh largest economy of the world, even in 2030, even with the continuing rise of China, even with India building up its capability and some other countries coming up on the inside. We're also going to be hugely powerful, I suppose you could say, still, in terms of our international assets. Now, I'm the first to point out that the UK's military assets have declined pretty significantly in the last 15 or so years. And even all the excitement of having 2 new aircraft carriers, they're pretty underpowered in terms of the assets they bring to the table. But everything is relative. And in relative terms, even though the United States, Russia, China, India will have many more hard power assets at their disposal than the UK does, and certainly does in 2030 compared to now, the UK will be at the top of the second tier of countries that bring a combined set of assets to the table. And what part of what the UK is able to do that other countries can't do is mix different forms of power. It will continue to be one of the biggest defense spenders in the world, certainly in that second tier. But it will also continue to be, even if it doesn't spend as much as a percentage of GDP on its development assistance, it will continue to be a big development player, even at 0.5, 0.6% of its GDP in 2030, one of the top 4 or 5. It also has the capacity to blend this with a very effective intelligence capability and cyber capacity, where the UK is one of the leaders in the world. And also you put into that mix there a pretty good foreign office and diplomatic capability. Those hard power elements are mixed in with the kind of soft power stuff that the government does not control, of the world's lingua franca, the world's leading international language, a very strong city, meaning its financial power is larger than many other countries around the world, a very strong NGO sector, meaning on humanitarian debates, UK mixing its non-governmental and governmental assets can have quite a bit of influence. I mean, you put all these things together, and the United Kingdom, universities, scientific capability, vaccine development, etc. The UK will be a player, in my opinion, on the world stage in the next 10 years. So the question is, what does it do with this? Because the one thing we've learned over the many, many decades of the past is that simply having power doesn't mean you can actually be influential. Even the US, which has huge amounts of power, can often not get outcomes that it wants, whether it's in the Middle East peace process or whether it's on global trade negotiations. So the question for the UK is, how does it use its assets in a splintered world where, in a way, it can't pretend it's a big mid-power or great power, as I said at the beginning. This brings me to the fourth point. I think there are several areas where the UK can pull together its national interests, its assets, the ones I've just been describing, then importantly, thirdly, its credibility as a player on the international stage to actually then have a voice, use its credibility, use its interests, and use its hard and soft power assets to be able to be influential. And I should have said, one of those big assets is the UK, even outside the EU, will still be a leading player in just about every other international institution in the world, from the UN Security Council through to the G20, G7, IMF, blah, blah, blah. What are those 6 areas that combine those assets? I won't spend long on them because I'll run out of time. But number one, it is about protecting liberal democracy, being one of those anchor countries of the liberal democratic community. And the UK's role in the G7 is particularly relevant on that this year. We can talk more about it later on. Secondly, promoting peace and security in its neighborhood. in its neighborhood, in particular in Central Eastern Europe, because of its NATO role, and also in sub-Saharan Africa because of its capacity to combine development assistance and diplomacy and humanitarian assets. Third is climate change. The UK is chairing COP26 this year, that's 1 year, but also it is one of the leading countries in terms of applying legally movements towards the Paris Agreement goals. And as you will know, it's a world leader in that space. Fourth is global health resilience, where the UK is a big player scientifically, a big player in vaccine development and rollout through COVAX, where it has also a big voice in the WHO, and has combined those sort of institutional networks to give itself a strong voice through the G7 in trying to drive this whole concept of global health resilience. Fifth, interestingly, I don't have time to talk enough about it now, but I think the UK should play a leading role on global tax transparency. You might say that's a courageous suggestion to make for the UK, given that it is the owner, you might say, of many of the world's least transparent tax jurisdictions. But I think global taxation is going to become one of the big issues of globalization in the future, especially when in the post-COVID world, people are going to have to be paying their ways in a very different way to the way they did before. And the UK should step up and grab that difficult challenge, which it started to do back in 2013. And finally, I think the UK should play a leading role on defending cyberspace, where it has real credibility. Look, the rest of my paper, and I will just whiz through them and not actually say anything about them, leave it to conversation. Number one, to do all of this, the UK will need partners. In my view, the EU will have to be the UK's leading partner once we can get through the pain of the divorce and start thinking about the future. But beyond that, I talk about the US, Asia Pacific, and Africa as being the key partners. Institutions, similarly, will have to be the EU, where we are most in sync with those 6 big goals. If the US has an administration like the Biden administration, then we're in sync. If it has something like the Trump administration, then we're not. So we're going to have to be quite thoughtful about this. And I'm kind of skeptical about some of the other countries the government has been trying to make its lead partners, like India and Turkey and so on. These are going to be very difficult partners, I think, going forward. And finally, to close, does the UK have the resources to do all of this? I would say it probably does on the defense side, it does on the development side. The one area the UK is going to have to invest a lot more is on its diplomatic capacity, which will become all the more important if it's going to make the most of the future. So I suppose my big, I don't know if it's a big idea, the idea I put forward is if you put all of these elements together, the UK will not be a miniature great power, but it can be a global broker because it can sit at the center of those nodes of decision making around big global challenges, global health, climate change, security in Africa, humanitarian development, and use its assets, use its credibility, use its good partnerships and seat at the table to do something constructive in the world. That's not all about me, it's about helping build a better world. Will any government do that in the next 3 to 4 years? I'm not sure, but I think it's a worthwhile goal to aim for. I'll stop there, Alex.
Thanks very much, Robin. And thank you for that overview of the paper. In this panel discussion, we have broken it down into 3 key themes. The first theme are Britain's alliances and partnerships. The second theme are Britain's capabilities, military, intelligence, development. And the third theme is whether Britain has the domestic political will for a more activist foreign policy. Each of those themes has a couple of questions, and I will ask the panelists one by one those questions, and then there'll be a broader discussion after each question. Before we jump into the panel discussion, I just want to introduce all of our panelists. Dr. Robin Niblett is the Chief Executive and Director of Chatham House and the author of the paper. Professor Richard G. Whitman is the Director of the Global Europe Centre and the Professor of International Relations and Politics at the University of Kent. And he's also a visiting fellow at Chatham House. And Michelle Rauschkob is the vice president of the Young European Socialists that works to brings Catherine West MP is the Labour MP for Hornsey and Wood Green, and she is the shadow foreign minister for Americas and Europe for the Labour Party. Now we can dive into our discussion. Under the theme of alliances, I thought, Richard, you could kick us off. And as Robin has mentioned, as we enter an age of great power blocks and competition with the rise of China, calls for greater strategic autonomy within the EU, and the US's preoccupation with the rise of China, will Britain have the clout to act as a global broker?
Well, Alex, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to all of those who are listening in. So we look forward to hearing from you as much as you hearing from us. So I hope that we can stimulate reaction. Maybe to kick off and to say something about what Robin said in terms of the global broker idea. I mean, why I think this is useful and a great basis for our discussion is that it gets us away from what I think has been a fairly turgid and particularly unilluminating way of thinking about Britain's foreign policy in the past, which is always going back to these Churchill circles of, you know, how we sit with the English-speaking world, with Europe understood in a particular way, and the Commonwealth or Empire when the idea was first articulated. So I think it's really great for us to be having a conversation that goes off in a different direction, because my goodness, we need it, I think. So thank you to Robin for that. On the question of alliances, and this is one of the things I think is really interesting about the paper, is how we think about alliances in the future. You know, we've particularly for the UK, we've thought about the UK obviously being embedded within a military security alliance, a transatlantic alliance that brings the UK together with the US and other European states. And we've also thought about the UK as being a member of the EU, but we haven't thought about the EU as being an alliance type organization. We tend to think of it as a sort of political and economic organization. And I think one of the things that Robin poses for us is, do we need to think about it as an alliance? Because one of the ways in which you can read his approach is that, you know, the EU could be our most important alliance partner, but we've not really been used to thinking about it as an alliance partner. In the past, we've thought about it in other ways. So, is there for us a sort of a way in which we have to remake our mental furniture or rearrange the furniture to think about the EU in quite a different way, to sort of maximise the opportunity that might be available to us as a partner? Then there are other kinds of alliances, and we've heard quite a lot about these, particularly in the context of the Global Britain discussion, the so-called Five Eyes intelligence community, which is breaking out now into more than just intelligence sharing, where we've seen gatherings of internal ministers, home secretaries, finance ministers, defense ministers. And is that a route that that's possible for Britain to get more juice from? And the idea of the D10, which Robin is skeptical about because of some of the partners, but I'll leave him to clarify why on that. But the idea of a grouping of democracies, which is the G7 plus Australia, Japan, Australia, excuse me, Korea and India, which the Prime Minister is going to invite to the G7 summit that's happening here in the UK this year. So that's an attempt sort of an alliance in the making, if you like, with a group of democracies, and it's something that the Biden administration has also expressed an interest in. So we're having all of these new configurations being tested as possible new alliances or new configurations for alliances for the UK at the time in which we face this major order sort of systemic change that Robin kicked off with identifying for us. So how does the UK fit? And obviously for this paper, it's the UK is if you like trying to find a niche that it can occupy. And one of our previous governments in the UK, the coalition government, Foreign Secretary there, William Hague, articulated an idea that I think was sort of lost, and it would be good if we refound, which is to talk about Britain as network power, which is it's part of all these different organizations and relationships, and it's being a part of all of those, which adds value for the UK, and absolutely crucially adds value for the UK's partners. And I guess the question is, having dropped out of one of those networks, having dropped out of the EU, is it possible to not necessarily find a direct replacement for that relationship, but to find a different kind of networkedness with the EU in a way that works, and particularly if it gives or brings to fruition Robin's idea of the UK acting as a global broker in close partnership with the EU. So I think, you know, this sort of periods of flux or change is absolutely fascinating for sort of analysts of the UK's foreign policy. But I'm really interested to hear how our politicians are going to how they're going to position the UK, because the global Britain idea so far, certainly for outsiders, has attracted a fair amount of stick. And I'm also interested to hear from Catherine and from the Labour Party how they view that idea. Do they see it as something that's very, you know, imbued with a sort of Conservative Party idea about how Britain's place should be in the world, or is it something that that the Labour Party feels that it can buy into? So thank you. Thanks, Alex.
That's fine. Catherine, I was wondering, you're a shadow minister for Europe and Americas. How do you see this and what Richard has just articulated?
Well, thank you to Richard and Robin for getting us started. And I'm very firmly of the view that, you know, our sort of values are really very much connected with Europe, and that this concept of being in an alliance with Europe is very important. Some of the Brexit behaviour around sort of at key points of the negotiations in the last 4 years, I think, have made us appear more alliance breakers than alliance makers. So we've got some we've got some running to catch up to do there to present ourselves in a bit more of a positive light. And I think we need to choose some themes. And I'm very interested in the government's own work on the, you know, strategic review and how it's going to bring all the elements of, you know, the various defence, international aid, and, you know, cyber warfare, which is such a big element now of, you know, trying to protect ourselves in terms of national security. I'm very interested to see what the government comes up with. We have the luxury of having a little bit more time in opposition to have these sorts of talks, and we're very much in a sort of a listening mode, although Keir Starmer has said that his key word for foreign policy is multilateralism. And obviously we are one of the only teams that I know of where we still have a shadow minister for, you know, multilateral discussions such as disarmament. You might know Fabian Hamilton, and he follows every single international meeting. And one of the things which we could do is just attend them. We've empty chaired a lot of the UN work in the last few years, partly through bandwidth, because Brexit was very demanding in a parliament with no overall majority. But we've really got to get back into that, because that's really what Britain's good at. And, you know, Britain wrote most of the European human rights legislation and policies and procedures and all that. Let's get back to what we're really good at. Very briefly on the US question, really pleased that Joe Biden has this love for Ireland, clearly loves Irish poetry, and, you know, he's got that lovely sense of humour and the twinkle in the eye and all the rest of it. And I just hope that this can be something which we can build on as English speakers, you know, and I think his experience in foreign policy means he remembers Senator Mitchell in 1998 holding up, you know, the two hands of both sides on the island of Ireland, and that was such a wonderful achievement, the Good Friday Agreement. And of course, you know, Brexit does put some of that at risk. I don't think, I would hope it wouldn't put it at risk in a long-term way, but there are some of the language which is coming back into our debate in Parliament is very unhelpful. And I would hope that the US will support us as we go through those problems. because we mustn't let the detail on Brexit, which is actually not very political, you know, whether you should have a veterinary check on this or that product, or, you know, which ferry port things should leave from. They should be pragmatic discussions which can be solved. But the trouble is, if you're coming from a very ideological position on Brexit or not Brexit, sometimes those sorts of practical discussions just don't ever get had. So it doesn't feel as though there's been a systematic approach to looking at the problems created since the 31st of December, in the way that the Prime Minister has in the last 24 hours with the lockdown. He's actually had some dates, he's had a plan. So I wonder whether the new advisors are more focused in on, you know, what we would call, you know, being a bit more about a strategy, because I really don't think that a lot of the issues around the border and Brexit at the moment are political. They're mainly pragmatic things which just need to be solved. Just very briefly also on climate change, we all talk about it, don't we, with the COP coming up in November, but I feel the biggest opportunity it gives us is for everyone to sit around the table and care about one thing, because in the end, that's really how the European Union was formed. Everybody sitting around the table and caring about peace and prosperity, and in the end, everything else sort of followed. And that's part of the reason why we haven't had a regional war since 1944. And that's really what we need to do with China, with Russia, with everybody. Just get everybody talking about the one thing that we want to problem solve. And I think that would give us a huge capacity for a global conversation about something which we know we have to talk about. The other point, just very quickly, is the economy. To say, I think that it would be a very interesting exercise to take Robin's work that he's done in the paper and overlay a sort of economic analysis of the stimulus package in the US, our own one, which will be announced next Wednesday, and whatever the European Union gets through or how it's spent. Because I feel for young people, you know, this is so critical. We have youth unemployment going through the roof at the moment. If we don't sort that out, we're going to end up with a lot of unhappy young people. And unhappy young people can often mean conflict. It can often mean, you know, less prosperity. You know, we have this imbalance we have to address about how asset rich older people are relative to younger people. And I feel that that is something which I know plays very much to Joe Biden's messaging, but we have got to sort of somehow get a hold on that, particularly because the EU, the UK and the US, we're basically aging democracies. And we need to get a grip of the intergenerational inequality so that we can really get a grip on that. One other point on Robin's excellent presentation was just to say, I feel that the NGO sector and aid and so on, I think everybody, you know, I have a different view. I wanted to keep the 0.7, would have voted for it, but given that the government is sort of going that way, they are saying it's temporary. But, you know, we mustn't forget the importance of the global health spend. You know, this is why we've been first in the vaccines, because it was originally a malaria vaccine, which Sarah Gilbert worked on in Oxford. And we mustn't forget that, you know, that's in our own self-interest. It's not just being nice to poor countries. It's making us more resilient. All that science and technology. I don't know if anyone saw the FT over the weekend, but, you know, our spend on research and development now is only just above Brazil's. The US is way ahead of us. Other countries are way ahead, and we've got to catch up on basic education for everybody and research and development for our niche sort of excellence, because otherwise we're going to fall behind. And just quickly to finish on Robin's point on the global tax transparency, couldn't agree more. And I had an hour with Bill Browder today talking about the Russia report and how we can get the government to actually carry out the recommendations in that, including really clamping down on the money laundering, which we can do, and taking the lead on it internationally. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. And actually, this ties us in very nicely with, I think, a question for Michelle. I was reading in the FT over the last week that is risking its future relationship with Europe to be, instead of one of alliances, as Richard has mentioned, but actual competition on every single thing will be competed over. And Michelle, you told us earlier that you live actually near a Pfizer factory. And the last couple of there was a breakdown in the relationship between the UK and Europe when it came to the vaccines, and the European Commission triggered part of the Northern Ireland Protocol and quickly backtracked. Do you feel that the last 4 years and the acrimony created by Brexit, is that irreversible, or can Britain and the EU move past this and actually forge a closer relationship?
I mean, I gotta say, it has to be reversible, right? I mean, I'm a young person, so there's gotta be hope for this relationship to be rebuilt. And also because I think what we're seeing with the Corona crisis right now is that solidarity is basically the key to every crisis that we're facing. If it is like the climate crisis, if it is the Corona crisis, if it is what some people would call like the migration crisis, I would call it a solidarity crisis. And we can only fight it if we're being united. And I think also that for young people, there is another layer of multilateralism there, as we are doing in our organization in the Young European Socialists, where we're bringing together young people from different European countries, and we still have the UK organizations in our organization, even though Brexit happened. And to have kind of also an internationalism from below, because I think what we're seeing at the same time, yes, we have governments, but we have also regional exchanges. We have urban projects that bring cities together. And I think this is also a sphere where progressives are really excelling at the moment. So I think there are still like spheres where we can work together as young people and work on the challenges ahead. Yeah, but of course we were disappointed with Brexit and with the kind of like vaccine, I would call it nationalism at some point, that we have been seeing from the UK. Also bearing in mind that like how many doses were ordered, like too many doses that like you don't have as many people as you have doses. Where at the same time we see the global south having probably a vaccine by 2024, which also means we won't be safe until then, to be honest. Yeah, so I mean, I see a lot of challenges and at the same time, I mean, I was campaigning in 2019 in Kensington with 30 other young people from all over Europe for another leader, to be quite frank at this point. So yeah, I mean, from the outside, the UK looks still a bit fragile. And particularly when we're looking at the death rates. I mean, we're talking about vaccines now, but how the GDP was more valued than human lives, I think is something that is worrying a lot of people in my generation.
Yes. And I think perhaps, Robin, in terms of our next question, and I think this ties neatly into it, in the paper you mentioned that what traditionally have been seen as areas or countries that Britain should consolidate its relationship with. For example, David Cameron went to China and he spoke about the golden age of relations between Britain and China. And obviously we all know that hasn't turned out to be the case. And China and the West are entering an age of competition. What other countries in the world do you sort of see where Britain has to manage its relationship in a sort of slightly more strategic, tactical way? I know you mentioned Saudi Arabia or Turkey.
Yeah, look, it's going to be quite complex and for the United Kingdom to work out a multi-vector set of relationships. I think that if, government is about making choices, and what I emphasize in the paper is I think we should sort of prioritize certain parts of the world and maybe some countries within it. As we noted here, and Richard drew out as well the comment that I made in the paper, really having close relationships with the EU and with individual European member states is going to be indispensable for the United Kingdom to achieve all it wants to achieve in the future. there are then a cluster of sort of liberal democracies, should we call them, that are quite close and easy partners for us because we have a habit of cooperation. Again, Richard mentioned the Five Eyes, and it's noticeable that Canada has been one of the countries that we've stepped forward with on a number of the government's human rights responses recent on sanctions against Belarus and the fraudulent elections that took place there, and also on some of the responses to Chinese treatment of the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang province. So you've got a small cluster of kind of, let's call them like-minded countries with which the UK has a good habit of cooperating, and I'd include certainly Australia in that group. But then once you start to prioritize beyond that, I think the United Kingdom needs to really think about the Asia-Pacific region. And I use Asia-Pacific rather than Indo-Pacific for the simple reason that within the Asia-Pacific region, there are a number of large democracies that are partners already of the United Kingdom, who, like us, are hugely dependent on an open global economy, that have good security relationships with the United States, but at the same time are trying to find a way of not allowing the world to slip into a new Cold War with China, even though they want to confront China on a number of very specific areas. And those are countries like South Korea and Japan in particular, but you could probably put in there Malaysia, Indonesia, some other big and important democracies. We've already seen some backsliding on democracy in that part of the world. Obviously, Myanmar and Burma have been in the news recently, but it's always been a pretty fragile democracy. But it's been sad to see Thailand go backwards in that direction. And it's a part of the world that's up for grabs, in a way, on this battle between more open forms of government and more controlling top-down authoritarian forms of government. And for a United Kingdom that's going to rely for a lot of its future economic growth, and a global economy that will rely for its future global economic growth on a successful Asia-Pacific, the UK should, I think, really commit to that part of the world. And engaging, as the government's talked to doing, with this Trans-Pacific Partnership, which now has the horrible acronym of the CPTPP, but nonetheless is an interesting agglomeration of liberal democracies, and by the way, some that are not. Vietnam and others are in that mix as well, but it is a group of countries that are trying to keep open standards to economic growth, and that is led by the liberal democracies in that region. I think we should really put an emphasis in that part of the world. That means, therefore, in terms of choices, being cautious about some of the countries and regions of the world that I sense the government in its old version of Global Britain wanted to lean forward to, specifically India. And I won't go into the whole D10 thing, maybe now we can come to it later on. But India, look, India is a big power in its own mind, and a big power in terms of its space. Yeah, it has the largest population in the world pretty soon. It'll be the third largest economy in the world pretty soon. But India is sui generis. India used to lead the G77. It does not want to be corralled into a Western camp. It's a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It has not criticized China for the repression in Xinjiang, nor for some of the steps taken in Hong Kong. So the idea that somehow India will just be a natural partner for the UK on Global Britain, I think is a bit naive. It'll be an important regional power. By all means, invite it to the G7 meeting, but the idea of making it like an anchor partner for a future liberal democratic camp strikes me as naive, especially given where the Modi government is going in terms of its internal politics right now. I think, the Middle East, the Gulf, complicated. They are not liberal democracies. They do really nasty stuff to their citizens quite often. You just can't have it both ways in today's more transparent world, where in a way we want to be an ESG foreign policy player. That's the kind of global health, climate change idea we're putting out there. Well, then you're going to have to partner with countries that meet the ESG standards of international politics. And very few countries in the Gulf do that. And I could put Turkey in the mix as well. So maybe I should stop there. I think the UK is going to have to pick and choose. It's going to have to be a lot more selective than this very open-ended global Britain idea implied. And obviously China is at the top of that list, but China is a whole separate conversation because, yeah, it's an economic power and we need to do climate change with it, but it is on the absolute opposite end of the spectrum for us on our values.
Thanks, Robin. I just want to say before we move on to the next theme, which is on Britain's capabilities, there's a question and answer function on the Zoom chat. So if you have a question, please put it in there and we will try at the end of the discussion to ask our panelists your great questions. Now moving on to our second theme, which is on Britain's capabilities. I wonder, Richard, if you could kick us off with this question. What are the most pressing challenges facing international peace and security at the moment? And what role can Britain play in helping to, solve them, considering that historically Britain has used multilateral institutions as the primary vehicle to solve these challenges, and multilateral institutions are under immense pressure?
Thanks very much, Alex. I mean, that's a great question, a huge question, but a great question. And part of the answer, perhaps, or part of the answer for us is how the government thinks about how it might answer that. And as Catherine alluded to earlier, we're waiting for this integrated review of foreign defence and development policy, which is due to be published next month. And I think an important part of that is how our current government will see the balance between diplomacy, how it see the balance there with defence, and absolutely crucially, I think, how that balances out with development policy. And with even, we obviously haven't seen that document yet, but what we have already seen are some things that anticipate that, particularly on the defence expenditure front, with the government saying that it's going to commit to this increased defence budget for the next 4 years. And we've seen the merger of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and DFID to create a new combined department, which I think raises more questions than it answers about the way that Britain thinks about the relationship between diplomacy and development, and absolutely crucially how it thinks about the development spend, where we've been focused laser-like on poverty and poverty reduction over the last decade and a half, 2 decades. And all of that matters, I think, because that's both a statement of intent on the part of our government, but it's also an ordering of priorities, how the government wants to see the things it wants tackled. And if you look across that, I think it's probably fair to say at the moment that defence has been a winner, that it's much less clear whether development policy is going to benefit from the reduction in expenditure we've seen, and the merger, and almost certainly the recalibration of development policy objectives, and then where the diplomacy fits into that. In other words, how the UK does the business of sort of reselling itself to the world outside. And this sort of cuts to your question, which is about multilateralism and how Britain uses multilateral institutions. I think we have to recognise that we have a kind of brand problem for the UK at the moment, which is that we have decided to leave a very successful multilateral organisation, and it was one that worked pretty well for the UK in terms of a reasonably efficient way of pursuing all sorts of foreign policy objectives. And what we're putting in place now in reinvigorating some older relationships, trying to start some new ones, sort of doubling down in organizations like NATO and so on, whether we can do as much as we did previously. And crucially, back to Robin's paper, how we strike a partnership with the European Union, which shares many of the objectives, almost all the objectives that the UK has, to make sure that we do all of those things, diplomacy, defence, and development, in a way which are good for the UK and also good for the EU, because I think we should also recognise that the European Union as a sort of political and economic entity isn't going anywhere, and we're going to have a great interest in what priorities the EU sets, but we're going to find it very, very difficult to have any say in those objectives, but some of the consequences of what the EU decides to focus on, and particularly if it becomes more inward-looking, the UK may have to contend with. So your question to me in the first round was one about strategic autonomy. So if I could put the two questions together, if you like, the EU's committed to strategic autonomy, which to me suggests that it wants to be a bit more inward-looking. And at the same time, it's characterized itself as a good or effective multilateralist in the past. Is it going to become more introspective, just at the same time as the UK is saying that it wants to be more sort of globally focused? And is one of the challenges for the UK to sort of nudge the EU to remain sort of multilaterally engaged in the way that the UK did a reasonable job within the EU in the past?
Yes, and actually just picking up on your point about the integration of DFID into the FCO, and the statement by Boris Johnson that development spending will be reduced to 0.5% of GDP now going forward. I know, Catherine, that the Labour Party opposed the integration of DFID to the FCO, but do you not think perhaps that this integration could actually in a quite successful way ensure that just as other countries are growing richer and development spending by Britain around the world becomes less impactful, the integration of the DFID to the FCO actually means that our money and our development spending can be used for sort of slightly more strategic priorities?
I think it's about looking at what the spend does. So a lot of the spend in Africa, for example, gave us a kind of a reason to be there, and good things to do, pulling women out of poverty, educating girls, setting up, really good trading arrangements or micro loans for, small family businesses, things like that. Now, vacating that space because there's going to be a cut to the budget, is that just an invitation to the Belt and Road Initiative of China just to come in and have that space? I don't feel that the government's really articulated why it wants to do that. If that is, because I think, when you're in opposition, you have an opportunity to challenge. And what I want to say to the government is, if you take away those, I guess you call them soft power projects or post-colonial projects or, poverty reduction projects or whatever they are, and they're always a bit multifaceted. Nevertheless, the realpolitik of the way that China operates is that those spaces will be filled by the Belt and Road Initiative, and we will lose our influence. So, I think the 16 billion that's gone into, which will probably go into hardware, that may in 5-10 years time be extremely important for some really important equipment or from some cyber programs. But I would need some convincing that the Department of Defence is spending the money it already has properly. I'm afraid I bring my local government council leader hat to this, and I never used to say that a department could have more money unless it had already shown me how it had spent the last amount of money it had got. And I just feel that part of that little bit of theatre that the Prime Minister gave us about the extra 16 billion for defence, it didn't really say how it was going to be spent, what was going to be the evaluation of that spend. Whereas at least with our sort of projects in Africa, we know exactly what it buys. And actually a lot of that important aid work is developing what has been absolutely essential in developing those vaccines. It's Sarah Gilbert in Oxford is, an expert actually in malaria and neglected tropical diseases development, which she's been doing in Africa for years. And there's lots of reasons why the UK has been doing that work. But I guess I would want to know that if that money is not going to be used in that way, but it's going to buy a really important submarine or a cyber program or something, then tell me what it is and tell me how it's going to do and be effective. I just feel that the government really hasn't laid out its reasoning for making that decision. And so I think Robin's paper and our discussion tonight, we're sort of doing the work for them. So I hope that we can challenge a bit more and just not be too sort of, I guess, looking inwards ourselves too much to think that if we don't do that work, some other big giant power will come and do that, and we will lose that influence, and we will lose that kind of, I guess, foothold that we have got in those important areas. Because as one of our other panelists said, decisions have to be made. You know, we're already a year into this parliament. We start campaigning a year out from the next election, so that's 2023. So the government has the rest of this year and next year to actually do something. And then after that, it's back into electioneering and not doing very much. So it needs to get a real wriggle on and give us some sense of direction. There's been lots of different models put forward tonight, and I think all of them have got strengths to them. And on the diplomacy point, I would really agree with that particular critique that's been given, that we have, since 2010, the number of posts that we have in missions abroad, selling off assets, just generally taking away our footprint from key places, including the ASEAN countries. You know, that's actually, there are a lot of question marks over that strategy, because if we think human rights is central to who we are, which we do, and I think there are some elements of Dominic Raab's work on Magnitsky sanctions, etc., which I wouldn't quibble with, although I would like to see corruption as a heading in those sanctions. But we do actually need our messengers on the ground to be carrying that out. And I think on the odd occasion over the last couple of years, we've been found to be wanting for our own citizens who are caught up abroad as well. And that just shows that we have underfunded our missions abroad. Sorry to be a bit all over the place on that answer, Chair. Getting close to my bedtime.
Actually, I think, Richard, you wanted to jump in on a point on the development side.
Yeah, thank you. And it was really to pick up on something that Catherine said, you know, the sort of unknown about development spend, because if we look back at our ODA, overseas development assistance spend in the past, you know, when it was under DFID's control, you know, DFID had a big focus on low income countries with the DFID spend. The part of the non-DFID overseas development assistance that the Foreign Office controlled had a big focus on middle income countries. So clearly there, you know, there has to be an issue of concern when we're thinking about where the development spend is going to be. And particularly, I think when the Prime Minister introduced, you know, part of the argument for the merger was the way that resources could be reconfigured as to where they're going to go and for what purpose, and whether we will lose, you know, that focus that DFID had on the very, very poorest countries, you know, very low income countries that it gave attention to.
Yeah. And Robin, you wanted to quickly come back to that as well.
Well, just very a couple of, because I think both been all very interesting sets of comments. Just very quickly on this, I thought that what's interesting about the merger, I mean, having lived in Washington during the time where they created the Homeland Security Department and had to pull together a whole cluster of very different organizations under one umbrella, and it really distracted the participants quite heavily from their main objectives. You know, when you look at what's taking place right now with the FCDO, we'll have to recognize that it will and is leading to some real disruption and loss of focus on both the diplomatic and the development agenda, just because it does. It's really complicated. And one of the things, though I'm sure there can be some more effective spending amongst some of the development dossier and the humanitarian assistance and official development aid dossiers. The fact is, if you're working on development, you're in many cases thinking really long-term about structural change and systemic change within communities and societies and countries that is very difficult to undertake. If you're working on foreign policy, you're most often dealing with crises in the short term and the near term. You're in a completely different mental space, and trying to have a department live in both worlds at the same time, you suspect that the long term will lose out to the short term and to the crisis management. And that's just one of those realities that concerns me a bit. I mean, I think the extra spending on defense was probably necessary, but if nothing else, and I'll defer to Catherine's experience in here on budget management, but I suspect it's been targeted principally at filling in the big black hole of the shortfalls that were standing for some of the huge equipment projects that are now being undertaken. So, I wish it were more strategically planned, that defense spending, but it's probably just going to enable the UK to live up to its existing commitments. In the end, what the UK is going to have to deal with, as any other significant power that wants to be influential, and certainly one that has a seat as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, the UK doesn't have a choice about whether being involved in international security or not. It has to be, if it's going to live up to its obligations. The big challenge here is we have to live in multiple worlds simultaneously. We are going to be part of the great power competition because we're an ally of the US. We're a key contributor to NATO and the deterrence that comes with that. And we have some soft obligations both in the Gulf and in the Asia-Pacific region in terms of military hard power obligations. We're also in a really difficult neighborhood. It's not just Central Eastern Europe and the sort of complicated relationship with Russia, it's the future of Africa. I mean, if Africa, that's a big word to use, but sub-Saharan African countries really suffer as a result of delayed recovery after post-COVID pandemic, huge population growth, climate stresses, that's going to lead to forms of insecurity that will come in and penetrate our part of the world. In the end, we're also going to be a contributor to big security challenges, the security of the internet, the security of global health pandemics. How do you define international peace and security in today's world is really difficult. It is not unitary, it's not even binary, it's multifaceted. And the one word I think everyone is alighting on is resilience. And I would add the word deterrence. You can work on your resilience if you can deter enemies or other things from happening to you. And as I said, that's a really complicated dossier to take on. I don't know if the government's got the bandwidth to do it, but we will see a little bit with the integrated review. Over.
Yeah. And Michelle, I was just wondering, from your perspective, obviously the EU is calling for greater strategic autonomy on a host of issues. Do you think there is still room for Britain to deploy its capabilities alongside the European Union when it comes to common challenges? For example, in the Sahel with France, I know that there's been a lot of partnership between the UK and France. Do you think perhaps there can be partnership between its capabilities between the UK and the EU, not just on a bilateral level?
And again, I hope so. No, I think there are also very concrete policy proposals that we could still work on as a European Union and the UK. And I think one is the supply chain law. I already said that I'm coming from Germany, and we just made this a law. Actually, in the last 2 weeks, this supply chain law to make corporations be responsible regarding human rights and environmental damage. And I think this could be one of the things to work on. But of course, also what I think Catherine mentioned, China in Africa, basically, because I think what we're seeing right now in the corona crisis is also that China is sending vaccines to Africa and the European Union is not, because we did not have a good leadership when it came to this question. So of course, I think there are partnerships. There should be flourishing partnerships with the UK and the European Union in those questions, or regarding those questions. Yeah, and actually, I just wanted to stick with you, Michelle, because I think the next question, as we move into the final theme of tonight's panel discussion, which is on domestic political will in Britain for a more activist foreign policy. I know there's a growing movement among young people about whether a state-centric approach to foreign policy is even the right course. You are vice president of the Young European Socialists, and you work, you're primarily involves organizations across borders and social movements across borders, building solidarity. Do you think that young people sort of view a state-centric approach to foreign policy and they don't they don't really want to have anything to do with it? I think they're just seeing that it's not functioning so well at the moment. So I guess like what we're seeing with like social movements, yes, they're working cross borders, and they're also educating themselves cross borders. When it comes to like the crisis we're seeing right now with like how to set up mutual aid, but also in supporting like queer communities cross borders with like the Twin City projects that I've mentioned earlier. Or when it comes to like climate change and exchanging how to build up like a local Green New Deal, or how to implement a local Green New Deal. And also maybe because I'm on the committee now in the Social Democratic Party, who's working on its platform for our general election this year, we're also thinking of projects like having a fund for civil society organizations in Europe. And I think that, or in the EU, and I think the UK should be a partner in this when we're seeing what we've already mentioned in Hungary or in Poland, where authoritarianism is growing. And I think the UK, with its principles of human rights and of democracy, is a very valuable partner there in projects like these.
Yes. And Richard, I know you're a professor of politics at Kent, and obviously a lot of your students are young people. In terms of sort of the future of international relations, what do young people sort of see as, what are they interested in? What do they sort of care about? Obviously, Robin has talked about an ESG foreign policy. Do you think that there's no way Britain cannot have an ESG foreign policy? It will have to focus on human rights.
I wish I could claim to speak for the young. That would be fantastic. So thank you very much for the compliment. It's really worth digging into public attitudes, and there's some great polling work that's been done over the last week by the British Foreign Policy Group, which is really dug into attitudes by different age group, attitudes towards, let's say, a more internationally vocational approach, as opposed to a sort of more inward-looking perspective on Britain's place in the world. And I think it's fair to say that generally the younger and better educated somebody is, the more likely they are to have an open-minded and sort of opportunity-focused approach towards the world outside, and the less educational opportunities people have had, and the more that they've suffered as a consequence of globalization in terms of living somewhere where there's been deindustrialization and so on. Those are really marked public sentiment, in terms of people's attitude towards Britain's place in the world and what they expect from Britain in the world. And that's something that should concern all of us, but particularly, with the UK being a country which is absolutely in the position in which it needs to engage internationally for its prosperity. There's no other choice for the UK that we have so many people, and the survey is very striking in that at least a quarter of the population really think that Britain, in effect, should sort of close itself off from major international commitments. That we should be worried that that's a problem. But I think it's also, and this is one of the legacies of the Brexit experience, is that we've ended up in a position in which we've had a lot of elite cleavage, if I can call it that, divisions within Parliament, divisions across parties within Parliament, divisions within parties and across parties. The same in the business community and within universities and so on, which means that we're in a very uncertain place, I think, in terms of how we conceive of what Britain should be in an international context. At the moment in which we face, a really major set of challenges, both the sort of systemic challenges from the rise of China and so on, the shifting public attitudes in the US, and we know very well from the US that public opinion matters in terms of the international posture of a state. So it's something that we absolutely need to give attention to. Just maybe where I can sort of say something about the young, if I may. I mean, what we know about the pandemic is that it's falling, the impact of the pandemic, certainly in the UK, is falling disproportionately on the young, and disproportionately on the young because of their economic opportunity. They're much more likely to have lost their jobs. much more likely to have lost their access to education, but also it appears that they'll also be much more likely to lose their opportunity for travel, possibly in the short term, where the older age groups may get vaccinated sooner, and so on and so on. So there's some real intergenerational solidarity issues that I'm sure will come into play in the next few weeks or months. But for me, a real issue, back to Robin's report, if I may say so, is where he finishes off when he's looking at resourcing a new foreign policy. And for me, a crucial part of sort of resourcing a foreign policy is that you need to have a supportive public, so a government can pursue a successful foreign policy. So if we have got sort of deep-seated anxiety, concern, unwillingness to engage with the outside world, then that's going to be a real problem for Britain's foreign policy in the future. Yeah,
and I actually just wanted to open it to audience questions now. We're getting close to the end, and it would be great if we have the panelists can answer some of our questions. The first question to Catherine, I was wondering if you can answer it, is from Tim. And Tim wanted to know, how does Britain maximize its soft power and work with countries that are not traditionally our allies?
I think we have to think carefully about when it's in our interest to try and pursue that, and when we're just going to be hitting a brick wall. So, for example, the refusal by the Chinese leadership to refusing to allow inspectors to come into the Xinjiang region and look carefully at what is going on and prove wrong the footage that's been shown of basically prison camps and women being treated appallingly. If countries are not going to stand up and say they'll open their doors and discuss human rights, which is what our values are, then I think we have to be realistic about how much sort of business we can do with them, if you like. So I think that's where we have to know what our limits are. But apart from those very obvious regimes, which are just generally problematic, and I would include the kleptocracy in Russia in that as well. I guess I come back to the climate change theme, in that we all know broadly that we have to work on it. I would also put in a plug, as we might have some young people in the audience, to please get involved in looking and watching on defence and on, basically disarmament. I know it sounds like a bit of a dry subject and something that, in the 1960s we cared about, but we just have to remember that with the proliferation of weapons, accidents happen, and young people care about the environment, and I would really like to see young people more involved in thinking through how we get that multilateral discussion going, how we talk again about peace, but in a very practical way, about stopping the proliferation of so many weapons by basically rogue states, and how we use diplomacy to those ends. So, there are a couple of very serious themes in there. I don't want to end our lovely discussion on some very serious and scary themes, but it's one of the reasons I came into politics was, being very concerned about, as a sort of back then a CNDer, but I'm still really care about everybody sitting around the table and talking about New Start, for example, the fact that Biden has had, Mr. Putin signing back up to New Start in the first month that he's been in. That's fantastic news. We haven't celebrated it really because so much else going on, but some of those more old-fashioned topics we do actually have to talk about as well. So in terms of Robin's 2 points on deterrence and resilience, I would say, what are our risks? Our risks are, some kind of terrible nuclear accident. So let's keep up with the multilateralism. And then on the human rights and values piece, let's really try and, be more assertive on the human rights piece with China. And thirdly, on the a leadership role on cleaning up our tax havens. Let's try and do that with the EU and with the US, because the three of us together, we could have a fantastic collaboration. There's no reason why Canada, Australia, New Zealand can't be in on that as well, and any other countries which want to be, maybe Singapore, they've got a better regime than others. You know, let's really take the leadership on that. It doesn't cost very much to do it, and it would give us something to talk about and something we could be proud about. And you think how much money we could give back to poor countries if there was less corruption and less tax evasion. So I'll leave my final points there, but it's been a fantastic panel, and I'm looking forward to hearing the concluding questions from my colleagues on the panel.
Brilliant. Thanks, Catherine. Our next question is from Joe. Joe actually works for your colleague, Catherine, Stephen Kinnock. Joe's question is to Robin, and it is, how should the UK respond to China's increasing confidence in breaking international law, for example, in Hong Kong or the Taiwan airspace? And how should it respond to China's disregard for the concept of universal human rights?
It is one of the big questions, which I know obviously this government, like others, is grappling with on a day-to-day basis. It's really a question of trying to find a sustainable line where you're not blown backwards and forwards and becoming unpredictable, not least because I think the Chinese will themselves respect predictability, even if they don't like some of the answers, more than they will unpredictability, blowing hot and cold at different times. Specifically to your question, Joe, I mean, I think you're not going to change China from the outside anytime soon, if ever. It's too large, too self-referential, and certainly currently and probably for the next 5 to 10 years at least, maybe longer, the Communist Party of China will have huge majority support amongst its people. Because of the material benefits it's delivering to the majority. I stress majority. Obviously, there's some minorities, and we know in particular that are discriminated against, and many people still in abject poverty. But by many standards, it's been doing a good job in delivering the basic goods to people. Admittedly, you can do that during the build-up phase. Once you get through the middle income trap, delivering this kind of successful route is much more difficult, and it's one of my big worries about the future of China. But during that time, sort of taking the kind of approach that we've taken in the West towards Russia, as we did towards the Soviet Union, which was, you know, trying to contain it, either literally or metaphorically, or literally or virtually, I suppose I should say, is a very difficult policy for a UK or any European government to undertake, because it's a long way away. China might be a country that is less people are more concerned about than they were before. They're more aware of the abuses taking place. There's been an increased centralization of power under Xi Jinping, but it's still not an immediate problem, the way, even for that matter, Russia continues to be with its cyber attacks and undermining democratic processes of governance, disinformation, etc., etc. So to try and mobilize against those international law steps in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in the South China Sea, even internally in Xinjiang, with the forcing so many hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million Uyghurs into camps. It's shocking, it's terrible, but it's a long way away. So try to mobilize, back to public opinion, the country and countries in Europe for that matter towards this is very difficult. What I would say is we need to focus principally on strengthening ourselves. And it gets to a point that I think Michelle was saying earlier on about critical supply chains and so on. What we need to do is to show to China that we are not overly dependent on them, and that their huge dependence on access to global economic markets is one that they need to worry about, rather than us having to worry about always keeping their markets open. Being able to show that we can be resilient and are not dependent on China will make them feel much less secure about internal steps they take that may then cost them in that relationship with the rest of the world. Actually, I think the Dominic Raab and this government took a very interesting step on Xinjiang by making it I don't know if it's been made actually illegal yet, but there are steps to make sure that British companies do not undertake supply chains or not part of supply chains that use forced labor in Xinjiang into their products that are then used outside and into the United Kingdom or into global markets. That way of calling out Chinese breaking of international humanitarian, so human rights law, is more effective than trying to sanction 5 members of the Chinese Security Bureau and freezing their assets, which they probably don't have any assets outside the country in any case. And all you do is then drive the Chinese around a nationalist response that we're being sanctioned by the colonial powers of the past. So you have to be very thoughtful about the approach you take rather than going down sort of knee-jerk reactions that might have worked in the Cold War or vis-a-vis the Soviet Union or even towards Russia currently. As I said, also strengthening steps internally is incredibly important within the United Kingdom. Media law, keeping an eye open for disinformation or misinformation that might be pushed by the Chinese is another step. I think on the hard power side, if we believe in international law, we should be part of freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea with the US, or making sure that we do a port visit to Japan that is being threatened now by illegal maneuvers around the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. We need to be present. We're not going to change the balance of power. We don't have enough ships. We're not credible in that sense. But we need to show that we take the rule of law seriously. And demonstrative effects can be as important at times as actually meaningful hard power steps of the sorts that only the United States can take. So I could go on. I think it's about making sure that we are calibrated in our response, that we demonstrate our commitment to our own security and show to the Chinese that we take their steps seriously and that we will confront them wherever they cross a line where we believe the Chinese themselves said they're adhering to international law. And that's my last point on international human rights law. We must be in the UN, in the G7, a champion for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which China signed up to as well. They would say it was a government before the communists came into power, but nonetheless, they did sign up to it. And we must be absolutely immovable in our defense on human rights in the UN formats, especially. That includes on cybersecurity law, by the way, where they're trying to move things into states dominating cyberspace and undermining the rights of individual citizens. Sorry, it's a big answer, but it's a big problem.
Thanks, Robin. Richard, our next question, I think perhaps you're best placed to answer this. How can the UK square, this is from an anonymous attendee, how can the UK square the growing calls for the UK government to decolonize its foreign policy, especially after the Black Lives Matter movement, whilst also maximize its role as a global broker in what many perceive as a neo-colonial project?
I suspect that this might be an issue that Catherine could answer better than me, in the sense that I think the current British government has a particular perspective on Britain's place in the world, a particular perspective on the way that it views its relationship with developing countries, and I think historic injustice issues. So I'm not sure that it's something that the current government sees as a first order issue to tackle, but I think it's certainly one that is and has been an unsatisfactory addressed issue in Britain's foreign policy. And if I may, sort of bring things back to a sort of historic challenge in the way that the Labour Party in the past sought to tackle this. If you go back to the 1960s, the Labour Party then was engaged in a very big tussle over Europe, but it was also thinking about what the UK's relationship should be with the developing world in particular, and Britain's responsibilities as a as a former colonial power and a country that was involved in decolonialization. And at that point in time, the Labour Party's tussle was, really it wanted to be more with the developing world than it did with Europe. And I think, interestingly, the Labour Party ended up in a position in which it saw Europe as part of the way of addressing some of the issues of its responsibilities to former colonies through development policy that it built up through the European Union. And obviously now, having left the European Union, it's going to retask, reconfigure, reorientate its development policy. But I suspect that the first order thinking is not going to be along the lines of what the questioner suggests.
Yes, Michelle. In terms of our next question, it's focused on vaccines, and there's a quote in Dr. Niblett's paper which says that the UK embarks on its journey at a moment when its competence is being called into question as a result of the government's handling of the pandemic. Our questioner is asking whether the UK's sort of quite successful rollout of the vaccine, which is gathering momentum, could have an impact on its foreign policy, and how other countries view the competence of the UK government.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on what your perspective is, because I mean, you can of course focus on like the privatization of the NHS and the health system, and you see that this basically failed, and you could then ask yourself the question if neoliberalism is the right system for society, of course, or if you think that like the vaccine rollout and that it is successful, and maybe that by June everything will be opened up again, we'll kind of like balance this out. But I wouldn't say so. I think especially like for the younger generation, it became quite obvious that like very neoliberal countries or very conservative, or countries that were led by conservatives, showed that like systemic change is necessary at this point in time, because it feels like security is not a place we can just go back to, because it's not there.
Yeah. Our final question, I thought, could go to Catherine. Catherine, obviously the whole idea of Global Britain was a Conservative Party slogan initially. Robin has tried to put some flesh on the bones of that slogan and try to articulate a different sort of role that Britain can carve out for itself in international affairs. Will the Labour Party under Keir Starmer, and if you have the privilege of entering government in the next 3 or 4 years, would the Labour Party keep the Global Britain mantra, and would you try and implement Dr. Niblett's new international role?
Wow, that's a big question. Just to briefly rewind, because on the Black Lives Matter, Richard mentioned the Labour Party, and just to say there's a lot of debate still internally in the Labour Party about the Black Lives Matter movement, the importance of teaching history, the things we're proud about, the things we're not so proud about, and just having an honest debate about that. But also this question of Global Britain has got some positive connotations around being inclusive. And by the way, have you noticed that foreign policy discussions are a bit sort of stale and white? I've noticed that myself. How do we get more young BME people interested in talking about foreign policy so that we can make sure that we're not being too colonial in our outlook? I speak as somebody who's getting on a bit too, but because we're always informed by younger people, and I think particularly young Black and minority ethnic communities are not as present in our discussion. So I would say we need to challenge ourselves as a sector in that. But I think we do have to reclaim this title of Global Britain. In the end, the Labour Party wants to have a close relationship with Europe. And we do very much see that when we're really grappling with those difficult issues, say around the China question, or around how we tackle the international money laundering, which keeps bad governments propped up, all those sorts of really difficult questions. It's going to be with European partners and with, you know, the US, particularly now with this new administration. We share so much in common. It's going to be those obvious places where we have to build alliances. And coronavirus has stopped that a little bit. You know, we're dying to meet, you know, various people across Europe and in the US, but also let's try and reinterpret global Britain for the good things, you know, remembering some of the bad things that happened in the colonial times, but also thinking about what impact have, you know, younger generation, Commonwealth or non-Commonwealth country young people got to tell us. You know, it's Commonwealth Day on the 8th of March. Let's not just have, you know, a staid old thing. Let's hear from young writers. That there's so many fantastic young African writers at the moment. They're just not getting the airtime. You know, how do we try and integrate all those wonderful thinkers, writers, performers, students? I would still make the case that global Britain is our best export is education, because you get to hear from fantastic people like Richard, Robin, and all our other great educators. And whenever we have trips abroad with the International Select Committee, Trade Select Committee or anything, I always talk about education because I think it's still the best export and a wonderful soft power tool. So maybe we can end on that positive note that global Britain can be reinterpreted, it can be inclusive. And I would hope that we can continue to attract young people to challenge the way that we think, but that we can have a good exchange and dialogue of ideas, because in the end, peace, security, human rights, these are the things which matter in foreign policy. It's the basics really, but we do need to have different perspectives and to be constantly challenged.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Before we end tonight's discussion, I just want to say thank you very much to all of our panelists who have each contributed unique insights to the discussion whether Britain has what it takes to act as a global broker after Brexit. It reminds me of the quote from Dean Acheson, who is the Secretary of State under Truman, and he once quipped that Britain had lost an empire but not yet found a role. Hopefully, global Britain acting as a global broker is this new role that Britain can discover. And I wanted to say thank you from all of our members to you as panelists. And I just want to say to the members, the Young Fabians International Network is always on the lookout for new members. If you want to get involved in foreign policy, if you want to discuss international relations and write about it and put on events, then please go to the Young Fabians website and get involved. And secondly, but not lastly, we are producing a pamphlet this year on future risks to British foreign policy and how Britain should manage those risks. If you want to get involved, if you want to write for the pamphlet, then you can submit a proposal. Please submit it before the 22nd of March, and we will have a look over it, and you can be published in the pamphlet, and hopefully the publication will take place around September. But anyway, I just wanted to say thank you so much to all of our panelists for, I'm sure, has been a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex. Nice to meet you, Catherine. Bye, Rob. Bye, Richard. Bye, Michelle.
Rio.
Thanks, Robin. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Richard.
Sorry, I'm just typing an answer to somebody in the chat in case they're still online, as we didn't get a chance.